school system is the 7th largest school system in the state of Tennessee. Matthew Brock was a student in the school system from August 2009 through his voluntary disenrollment in 2021, the middle of his 10th grade year. The school system provided Matthew with reading and behavioral interventions and other accommodations as part of its special education services throughout his enrollment in the school system. Matthew's IEP teams, including Matthew's parents and representative, met 23 times during the 10 years he was eligible to receive services. Together, the team discussed what interventions and accommodations Matthew would receive based on his needs at that time. The school system philosophy is to meet the student where they are and tailor its services to each student. Matthew qualified for special education services under multiple categories, including reading, writing, math, and behavior. While enrolled in the school system, Matthew was able to access the general education curriculum. He was on track to graduate with a general education diploma when his parent and representative voluntarily disenrolled him in the middle of his 10th grade year. After his disenrollment, Matthew's education was handled by the Home Life Academy, a private online homeschooling program chosen by his parent and representative. As of September 16, 2025, Matthew has been out of the school system for over 4.5 years. The school system provided appropriate accommodations and interventions to Matthew for 10 years. At no time did the school system act with the intent to discriminate, nor were they deliberately indifferent to Matthew's learning disabilities. Ms. Roloff?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Victoria Roloff, and I represent the Clarksville and Montgomery County School System. I know we've been going through Warrenbeer and asking lots of questions already this morning, so I'm going to try to do my best to not repeat anything and be as quick as possible, but I just have a few additional questions of you guys. Do any of you guys have kids yourself? You also a juror? Oh, okay. Miss Payne, can you tell me about your kids?
I have 3 children. 2 of them are married. I do have a child that has been diagnosed with ADHD when they were 8 years old.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit more about your time with your child who's been diagnosed with ADHD?
Well, it's challenging. There's not always the recognition early on of what's going on, and sometimes they're very highly intelligent, so they're able to sometimes disguise things that not make you aware that they may be having issues.
And you said your child was diagnosed at 8. How old are they now?
13.
Where do they go to school?
We live in Franklin.
Okay. Miss Ayers, you also raised your hand that you have kids.
I have 2 children,
Can you tell me a little bit about your kids? How old are they?
5 and 9.
Okay. Where do they go to school?
They are in the Sumner County school system.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, you also have children?
Yes, 4 that I know of.
Okay. What can you tell me about your kids? How old are they?
I have 2 twins that are 10, and then I have an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old.
Where do they go to school?
Well, the 6-year-old is in kindergarten, but we're keeping her home. And then the others go to elementary school in Montgomery County.
Okay. What elementary school?
They go to Westside Elementary School.
And Mr. Holmes, you also raise your hand?
Yes, I have 6 kids.
Okay. How old are they?
Some maybe Mr. Harris. They
just feel like the teachers are overrun, they don't have enough time to really handle the needs of the kids, so it can be a little frustrating.
How about you, Ms. Bain?
I think sometimes it's hard to, have them understand the behavior, and then sometimes sometimes it's equipment, sometimes things that you really have to struggle for them to provide, and then oftentimes it's an update, and when you've got a classroom full of kids and you only have one that requires that need, sometimes they kind of get lost in the shuffle sometimes.
Do you feel like your interactions with your child specifically would impact your ability to serve impartially on this jury?
No.
Ms. Ayers, I believe you also raised your hand saying you have a net negative.
We just don't get any feedback from our teachers, in questioning how our child is doing. They don't respond to emails, and in parent-teacher conferences, there's no feedback, it's just, he's doing well.
And Mr. Holmes?
We're satisfied with the school system.
Now talking about your own experience in school, how many of you would say you had a net positive experience when you were in school yourself? Okay. No one had a net negative experience as a student when they were in school? Okay. Have any of you, I know, have any of you or your close family members had any interactions as a student or parent with the Clarksville Montgomery County School System? Yes, Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, I have 3 kids that go there, so we interact with them pretty regularly.
Right. How would you describe your interactions with Clarksville Montgomery County specifically?
I think they do their best, but like I said before, they feel like they're overwhelmed. So I think they're probably trying to do the best they can, but it's just sometimes I think they probably have a pretty tough job.
Okay. Do you think your interactions with Clarksville Montgomery County School Systems would impact your ability to be impartial as a juror?
I don't think it would impact my ability to be impartial, but I can't leave those interactions at the door. I mean, I'm gonna carry those with me as I'm here.
Okay. Anyone else have personal or close family interactions with Clarksville Montgomery County School System? Have any of you or a close family member ever been diagnosed with a learning disability? Yes, Ms. Dunbar?
I have dyslexia.
You have dyslexia? Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with dyslexia?
I went through the school system actually under a gifted IEP for intelligence, but had difficulty with my reading, so I had to enter into special classes for having my reading disability.
Okay. Where did you go to school?
Montgomery County.
How were your interactions with Montgomery County?
Very good.
Anyone else or their close family member that's been diagnosed with a learning disability? Besides Ms. Dunbar, we already talked a little bit, have any of you or your close family members had experiences with special education services provided in the school system?
We have a cousin that has Down syndrome, he's out of the school system now. But
What do you know about your cousin's interactions with the special education system?
I don't have a lot of details, but I know that he went, I think especially in the younger years, it had more to do with the teacher and who it was, how the teacher could work with someone with this, disability. And then, of course, in, middle school and high school, there was
she would just, attend to special needs kids and, try to, help them with whatever their needs were. And she would go like to one school a day, go around the county.
And Ms. Ayers, you also raised your hand?
Yes, I'm a PE teacher, and I have a couple of students with disabilities.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with your students?
I have a couple, one with physical disability, which we include him in the activities as best we can to modify the activities that we do, so he feels included. And then we have another with a learning disability, which doesn't really affect the PE class too much, but we are aware of that and try to notice any problems that he may have.
Okay, thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Yes, Ms. Becky?
I am a pediatrician that was very fun about having children, but I do have patients who have disabilities. And the majority of my patients are from Livingston County, and I feel like that the parents are very pleased with the school system in Livingston County, that they do a good job about with the children with disabilities, with our learning disabilities.
Okay. Do you, as a physician of any of these kids, have to interact with the school system directly?
Do I?
Yes.
No.
Anyone else who has any interactions with the special education school system? Yes, Ms. Dunbar?
My sister, mother, and aunts are teachers, and my aunt is, one of my aunts is a special education teacher.
Okay, where do they teach?
Out here in Nashville, except for my mother, she's in Montgomery County,
Okay. What school does your mom teach at?
Glen Ellen.
Okay. You said one of your aunts is a special education teacher?
Yes.
Do you know much about what she does on a day-to-day in that role?
I know her life is hectic, and she works all day at work, and then she goes home and works at night, usually reading students' IEPs and trying to tweak strategies and getting back with her teams.
And your mom and sister, it's general
Okay, at this point, I'll remind you back again of what Brian gave you as the plaintiff's theory of the case. This is generally a case of a now 21-year-old student who left the school system at grade 10 and a half, so in 2021, in March of 2021, and has not received any reading interventions from that point until now. You will hear that, as you heard in Brian's theory of the case read for you about the plaintiff, that the school system had a school psychologist who rendered a reevaluation opinion in which, and she had never dealt with a student before, in which she said, and this was 1 year before he was disenrolled, that the school system failed Matthew because he cannot read. But new interventions were put into place. Again, that was the 10th grade year. We also had COVID during that year, which you will hear about. Less than 1 year after that reevaluation requested by the parent and his girlfriend was performed, the IEP teams were meeting and providing additional services as requested by the parent, and they made the choice to remove him from the school system altogether, take him to homeschooling that had absolutely no interventions and was purely online. He has since received a general education diploma from Home Life Academy. He worked for a little less than a year as a welder, making $19 in overtime an hour, which is significantly more than the $34,000 an hour that you heard in the plaintiff's theory of the case. But he has since been laid off. He is back at his own landscaping business. He owns a large truck and a trailer and goes around and does landscaping. You will also hear that he had co-disabilities of math and behavioral issues, which are going to be part of what you will hear in the opening and what will be discussed by the teachers that you will hear before you. I am not the plaintiff's attorney, so I'm not advocating it as forcefully as he would, but I think those are the salient issues that you need to remember when listening to the defendant's opening argument. There are constraints. Victoria has been told by the court, you can't argue the law so much. You can't make your most forceful arguments. Those are closing. This is really your narrative of the case to give an outline so the jury understands what they're going to be hearing. And she will remind you that the plaintiff goes first and goes last because they have the burden of proof. So when you listen to the defendants, just keep an open mind, and that's what we would ask you to do. We will ask you at the end of the opening presentation, based upon things that you maybe were not asking voir dire, and she is limited, we are limited to voir dire of about 10 minutes each side. The plaintiff would have already asked you questions, the judge would have already asked you questions. So to the extent you had information that she didn't ask you about, understand she will have more information of the jurors than she did necessarily of you. But we are going to ask you to, it's partly an exercise, and is there something she should have caught that would make you rule one way or the other? And I know you're going to have a very limited amount of information, so just looking for trends. And that's why we didn't have her vote or strike anybody before the openings. Everybody understand that? Any questions before that? Okay.
Okay. So before I start, I just want to say we have not worked out like the timing of the clicks yet, so that might be a little choppy. Good morning, everyone. I know I've already been introduced to you all, but just to say again, my name is Victoria Roloff, and I, along with Rebecca Devery and Caitlin Kirk, represent the Clarksville and Montgomery County School System, who will be represented this week throughout the trial by their teachers and Ms. Celia Dunbar. You'll hear the Clarksville and Montgomery County School System referred to as a few different things throughout this trial, such as CNCSS or the school system. So just so you guys know, that's the defendant in this case. As you've already heard, this case is about Matthew and his time and experience in the school this trial, we will be talking about Matthew's time in the school system. However, what we ask for you guys to focus on as well is the teacher's experience during that time and with the information that they will give you about Matthew during that time. As well, we ask you guys to focus on the 4.5-year gap that has passed since Matthew voluntarily disenrolled from the school system by his dad. However, to understand all of that, I do think to get the full picture, we do really need to start at the beginning of the relationship between Matthew and the school system. In the 2009-2010 school year, Matthew first enrolled in Clarksville, Montgomery County, and for kindergarten. Now, as that year went on, he did not meet the requirements to move on to the first grade year, so in the 2010-2011 school year, he completed kindergarten. During that school year, he was referred for a special education evaluation at the request of his mother, Carrie Brock. At that time, Matthew did not meet the standards of eligibility to receive a special education and additional services. He moved on to first grade in the 2011 and 2012 school year. Now, in February of 2012, Matthew was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, or ADD, which you will also hear called ADHD, by his family doctor. After he was diagnosed, he was referred for another special education evaluation by his mother. He was evaluated by Dr. Patty Wilson, who you will hear from this week. Dr. Patty Wilson evaluated Matthew, and that evaluation resulted in him being eligible for special education and additional services under a category called Other Health Impairments, or OHI. I expect you will hear during Dr. Wilson's testimony that Matthew also met the standards of being identified as having a learning disability. However, when his IEP team met and discussed the available data, they determined that OHI was the most appropriate category of eligibility. I also expect that you will hear from a number of our witnesses that a category of eligibility does not drive the services a student receives. Matthew, like any other student who receives special education and related services, receives services in areas of weakness that he may have had. And for Matthew in 2012, that would have been reading, writing, and math. Now, I talked about an IEP team, and I understand some of you might not know what that is. I know I did not know what that was for a while, till very recently. An IEP team is a group of individuals that includes students, parents, or representatives, the special education teacher, a general education teacher, and a representative of the school system, which can also be called an LEA representative. The IEP team can even include the student once they become 14. So when you hear myself, Mr. Gilbert, or one of the witnesses talk about an IEP team, that's just when Matthew's parents or a friend of the family, Ginger Fitting, met with some teachers and a school system representative to work together to set goals and discuss the plan and any changes that might be made to determine what was best for Matthew. After Matthew was evaluated and determined to be eligible to receive special education and related services, the IEP team did meet to determine what that looked like specifically for Matthew, and those services were then implemented. However, it does not end there. I expect you will hear that Matthew's IEP team met a total of 23 times from the time of his initial eligibility until he was voluntarily disenrolled in 2021. One reason you'll hear that IEP teams meet so frequently is because they're constantly looking for new information to reevaluate the supports of the student. Now, when we talk about accommodations, interventions, and aids given to students, they do not have to be perfect. We don't get to come in today or this week and look back and tweak the accommodations to what could have been better with retrospect. The standard is merely that the accommodations needed to be reasonable at the time. Now, in 4th grade, Matthew was reevaluated to determine if he continued to be eligible for special education services, and I expect that you will hear that his IEP team determined he was still eligible to receive those expect you'll even hear that she tutored Matthew after school on her own time when Matthew was in middle school. I expect you'll hear Ms. Mayfield and other teachers who worked with Matthew about his behavior and how that influenced his time at school. And I expect you will hear Matthew was hard to keep in the classroom for a number of reasons. Whether he was receiving in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, he would just get up and leave the classroom, or he was out of school for some other reason. I expect you will hear how Matthew's interventions and accommodations began to include behavior, attention, reading, writing, and math. And I expect that you will hear that there's a bit of hierarchy of how those interventions and accommodations were given. What I expect you will hear from some of his teachers is that first you had to get Matthew in to control his behaviors and be in the classroom to learn the material. Once a teacher was able to get Matthew into a classroom, then the teacher had to get him to attend to the material being taught and not just put his head down. Once Matthew was both in the classroom and attending to the lesson being taught, then that is when the teacher was able to give him interventions and accommodations for reading, writing, or math. And I expect you'll hear that that was a constant battle his teachers were facing. And that it would take any length of time, and it was a back and forth. In 2016-2017, Matthew started middle school. You'll hear from Dr. Tanisha Taylor, who was Matthew's case manager during his middle school years, and who I expect will tell you that she experienced similar difficulties as Ms. Mayfield did getting Matthew into the classroom to learn. Matthew's behaviors became so disruptive to the classroom that he was eventually put on what is called a Behavioral Intervention Plan, or a BIP BIP. I expect you'll hear that a purpose of a behavioral intervention plan is to reduce disruptive behaviors and reinforce with alternative positive behaviors for the student. And I expect you'll hear one of the main tools Matthew was given was the use of something called the Chill Pass. The Chill Pass allowed Matthew to leave the classroom when he felt frustrated to go to a designated place to calm down for about 10 minutes. However, I expect you'll hear from some of his teachers that Matthew would have used this Chill Pass to leave the class and not go to that designated spot, or to leave class and never come back. Throughout all of this time, Matthew's IEP team continued to meet, Matthew's behavioral team continued to meet, and Matthew continued to move from grade to grade. And Matthew's team did another reevaluation in 7th grade, which identified him as continuing to be eligible for special education and related services. In 2019, in the 2019-2020 school year, Matthew started high school. And I expect that when Matthew started high school, his behavior started to become a little better. While it wasn't perfect, and he was perfect as a freshman in high school, it was better, and the behavioral intervention plan even was removed. However, the Chill Pass that we talked about earlier continued to be on his IEP, and I expect you will still hear a few reports about his behavior and the use of his Chill Pass in high school. You'll hear from a number of his high school teachers, including Miss Erin Purdy, who is Matthew's case manager for his 9th and 10th grade years. I expect you'll hear a number of things from Miss Purdy, who had a good relationship with Matthew. However, the main thing I expect you will hear from Miss Purdy is that Matthew was great when he could connect what he was learning to what he wanted to do in the future. And ultimately, what I expect you'll hear that he wanted to do in the future was do something with his hands, whether that was work in the construction field, welding, or landscaping. He wanted to do something with his hands. However, I expect you'll hear from Ms. Purdy and other teachers that when Matthew could not make that connection or didn't want to do something for whatever reason, he just wouldn't do it. In January of 2020, 2020, Matthew's IEP team did meet to discuss Ms. Christensen's findings and how to adjust his goals, interventions, accommodations to best support Matthew at that time. You'll hear that that included Matthew's dad and Ms. Fitting requesting that Ms. Erin Purdy work with Matthew on his reading. And I expect that you will hear that that was something a bit out of Ms. Purdy's comfort zone. However, I expect you'll hear that Matthew did not get along well with his prior intervention teacher, Ms. Graves. I expect you'll hear that Ms. Purdy was up to this challenge and spent some extra time before the next year with the district individuals to learn how to provide structured reading interventions to Matthew to accommodate what was believed to be best for Matthew at that time, and as requested by Mr. Brock and Ms. Fitting. I expect you'll hear from a few district employees, namely Ashley Forbes and Talia Dunbar, who will talk about trainings that that were being provided for individuals providing special education and related services specifically for children that were showing characteristics of dyslexia. And in the 2020-2021 school year, Matthew started his 10th grade year. I expect you will hear that Matthew was one of the first students to be brought back in person to school so that he could get his supports and accommodations and interventions as he needed. I expect you'll hear that that included Matthew receiving after-school tutoring by an elementary school teacher, Ms. Karen Folko. You'll hear from Dr. Carolyn Kennedy, who was the assistant principal at Northeast High School when Matthew was there, and I expect you'll hear about her interactions with Matthew, Mr. Brock, and Ms. Fitting. You'll also hear from a number of Matthew's 10th grade teachers. You'll hear from Ms. Patricia Zirkle, who was Matthew's biology inclusion teacher, as well as Ms. Samantha Winters, who was Matthew's English 2 inclusion teacher. And I expect you'll hear about the different versions of Matthew these two teachers experienced in their classroom. You will also hear from Mr. Jason Pennington, who is Matthew's construction teacher. I expect you will hear from Mr. Pennington about how he wishes he could have 15 Matthews in every class because of how great he was. I also expect that you'll hear from Mr. Pennington about how great of a person Matthew is outside of the classroom. However, I also expect you'll hear that in March of 2021, Matthew was voluntarily disenrolled from CMCSS. At this time, the school system could not provide Matthew any interventions or accommodations anymore because he was no longer a student. I expect you'll hear that Matthew enrolled in an online homeschool system called Home Life Academy. I expect you'll hear that despite Ms. Purdy's less than a year of interventions she was able to provide during his 10th grade year, there was noted improvement in Matthew's skills prior to his disenrollment. And I expect that you'll hear from Matthew's teachers that there was noted significant decline in his participation in the class prior to the disenrollment. Lastly, I expect you'll hear that since March of 2021, Matthew disenrolled from the school system and enrolled in Home Life Academy and has received no instruction